In 1961, the photojournalist Eve Arnold documented a Nation of Islam event in part led by Malcolm X in Washington, D.C., promoting Black power and liberation. The series is beautiful, including not only photographs of Malcolm X, but also of the crowd. And among these incredible pictures, there's this one. 3 white men stand out in the front row of a crowd of black people, but what makes them stand out isn't only the fact that they're white, but more importantly, the fact that they were Nazis. Both the Nazis and the Nation of Islam believed that black and white people couldn't coexist, though the Nazis believed so because of their belief in white supremacy, while the Nation of Islam believed so because they thought white institutions would never let them fully integrate. So both had similar aims, but for very different reasons. But in any case, George Lincoln Rockwell, the man in the middle of this picture, admired the Nation of Islam and particularly its leader, Elijah Muhammad, who he called a black Hitler. That was meant as a compliment. When I raised the camera to photograph Rockwell and his men, he hissed at me, "I'll make a bar of soap out of you." I hissed back, "As long as it isn't a lampshade," and kept on photographing. I think it's very important to underline Eve Arnold's courage for taking pictures in such events. Perhaps because she was Jewish or white, she finished photographing a Harlem Nation of Islam event with a dozen burn marks on the back of her clothes from men putting out their cigarettes on her.
So, first of all, Jews are not white. They're a tribe, a Semitic tribe from the Middle East. White is a social construct that applies to a specific demographic of people that have gained a lot of privilege. And they are typically the European white immigrants that have come to America and created that population.
George Lincoln Rockwell founded the American Nazi Party in 1959. He hated communists, Jews, black people, and queer people. He's also the man who coined the expression white power. In 1964, he was invited to speak at the University of Michigan, and such invitation sparked controversy. It wasn't the first time that he'd speak at other universities and do debates. Many people wondered how responsible it was to invite a Nazi on campus. Some believed that, though Rockwell has the right to his opinion, a university shouldn't give him the legitimacy of an invitation given how dangerous Nazi ideas are. Some believed in the marketplace of ideas, and that if Rockwell's ideas didn't make sense, they'd be simply ignored. Rockwell himself believed that, or at least used that belief to his advantage. Others answered that Rockwell didn't appeal to reason, but to emotion, as fascists do, and that his ideas in the marketplace of ideas endangered the very existence of that marketplace. Despite protests, both before and during the event, the speech was given on October 13th, 1964. For posterity, it was recorded, and I listened to all of it. It's incredibly relevant for today's context, though, as you may imagine from a 1964 Nazi, he didn't have to hide his racism. There's the conspiracies, the critique of how black people are portrayed too nicely in movies, talking about how weak and soft Americans are now, saying that queer people want to outlaw heterosexual sex and that they should be run out of the country, saying that white people are the true victims of hate in America in 1964. And finally, he complains about being punched in another university campus. Anyway, if you're interested in listening to the speech, it's like about an hour long. I'll put in the description of the video. If I forget, which I might, just write a comment. I read all my comments, as you know, so I'll be reminded and then I'll link it in the description. But yeah, you've been warned. It's, as you may imagine, it's extremely violent, it's racist and bigoted.
Now, you were in the laundromat at the time of the shooting. Did you hear the shots?
Yes, sir. I heard the shots and footsteps when he ran back across the building, and saw Mr. Rockwell fall out of his car on the passenger side of the street. Yeah. And 2 shots had been fired through the windshield, and we went out almost immediately, and he was dead almost immediately.
3 years later, Rockwell was assassinated, shot by his former colleague. Now, was that a good thing? I'd much rather live in a world where these kinds of murders don't happen. But as John Lindsay, New York City's mayor at the time, said about the murder, violence breeds violence. I've been meaning to make a long-form video on political violence, but I've also been meaning to make a video on fascism, and I've been wanting to do that for months. So I'll make this short. Americans, from Trump's assassination attempt to later completely unrelated news, have used the term political violence to simply talk about overt interpersonal violence which have political aims. But what if someone who has the influence that Rockwell had used that influence to, for example, call for running queer people out of this country? Or what if they spread the Great Replacement theory, trying to make white people fear that they'll become a minority, turning them against people of color? Or what if they say that Muslims want to import values into the West that seek to destabilize our civilization? What if he advocated to force women who have been raped to stay pregnant? Those are all incredibly violent positions which by themselves don't have that many consequences, but spewed from a powerful and influential fashion.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of those points being violent and racist and anti-American and anti-Western civilization, with the exception of the Islamic ideology, which this gentleman with the very nice hair is completely ignorant about, and that's part of the problem on the left. They are ignorant. They are uneducated. They don't understand that Islam is a political ideology. It's a supremacist, totalitarian political ideology, which has a basis of being sent from God, and that is the religious aspect of it. The religious aspect of it is a very small part of it. It is like a pizza, and the religion is just the pepperoni on a 10-topping pizza. The supremacist ideology, the racist ideology, the violent ideology, the entire system of laws that are included in Islam, which cover more facets of human life than any other political ideology covers, because it is totalitarian. It is total in its legal system and legal structure that is supposed to determine everything about human life and everything about politics, everything about the law. So typically we see on the left that they are completely ignorant about this, and it's really sad because if the left claims to be in a political position on the spectrum and they are opposed to right positions on the spectrum, then they should be the most opposed to the Islamic position on the political spectrum, because the Islamic position on the political spectrum is so far off to the right end of the political spectrum that it's not even possible to put it on the political spectrum of any Western country. And that is perhaps why the left is so ignorant about it, because they're completely incapable of understanding a political ideology that is so far right, it doesn't fit anywhere in our understanding of political spectrum.
Fascists are, if we are to take a consequentialist approach, much, much more violent than the death of a single man.
So his point of this video, and I think it is a bit distasteful, he released this video 6 days ago, which was 2 days after Charlie Kirk was shot. So basically, immediately after Charlie Kirk was shot, he thought it would be a good idea to come up with an example of an actual Nazi that was assassinated for speaking Nazi rhetoric and propaganda and pushing violent Nazi views on college campuses. And he put this out at a time, obviously, 2 days after Charlie Kirk is shot, as a comparison. And he had just said that shooting one man versus allowing his propaganda to cause so much more violence, possibly killing tens, thousands of people, is better. Now, I think we can clearly see what the purpose of his video here is, the agenda that he has. And I actually won't disagree with him that if somebody is indeed, for example, Rockwell, a true Nazi, and they are assassinated, I'm not going to mourn his death. We don't have to mourn the death of somebody that actually is evil. I don't think anybody is mourning the death of Hitler. I hope not.
The irony that George Lincoln Rockwell, who advocated for white Americans to get armed to protect themselves against communists, black people, and Jews, was shot to death. But I much prefer the analysis of Mayor John Lindsay when he said violence breeds violence, taking in consideration that Rockwell was violent without ever breaking the law. And because this video is about Eve Arnold's picture, of course, I also like that this image is what George Lincoln Rockwell will be best remembered by. A photo of him in a black crowd, cosplaying as a Nazi 16 years after their defeat, looking extremely uncomfortable and out of place, with his arms crossed. Would I rather live in a world with less murder? Of course. Would I rather live in a world with less Nazis on it? Of course. I think it's possible to, without rejoicing his death, not mourn it either. Let me know what you think of the assassination of the founder of the American Nazi Party, George Lincoln Rockwell, in the comments. As always, I read all of them.
So, I think he is making a very strong point at a very bad and distasteful time, obviously. But the point that he's really trying to make here is comparing an actual Nazi to Charlie Kirk. Let's be real. He's giving an example of an actual Nazi whose death I don't think we should mourn, but we should not celebrate. And he is doing it at a time directly after a person who is being accused of being a Nazi was assassinated. And I think that speaks volumes. I think that that says enough about the rhetoric and the ignorance of the so-called left. And I can say that this person right here with the wonderful hairdo is a so-called left. He is the example of the kind of person that is ignorant, does not have a lot of experience in life or the topics that he's discussing. And so he creates all of his narratives and his views without having very important facts that support those views, that validate those arguments. And then he is relating his ignorant slander of one person and framing it on another. This is wrong. There's no comparison between Charlie Kirk and Rockwell. But that is what he is effectively trying to do with this video. And if that is the kind of rhetoric and that is the kind of justification that is coming out of the left, the so-called left, it is disgusting, it is reprehensible, it is wrong. That is why we say they are not left, they are not right, they are wrong. They are downers, they are not leftists. So, I actually thought the video was pretty good, except for the undertone of the message that it is trying to deliver. Worth a watch, simply for the historical information. Otherwise, the true message of this video, I absolutely disagree with. And I think this is part of the problem of the so-called left. That's why I'm attacking it. But the historical context, interesting, worth a watch. Just keep that in mind while you're watching it. And I'll see you in the next video.